Today, our subject is, in a sense, way out of this world, only in a sense. As you can see, we have two questions in particular upon which we'll be focusing this evening, and we have quite a bit to discuss based upon them. So without any further ado, let's take a look at the first question. Some religions teach that this life is lesser than the afterlife, or that it is a test to get to a better, more spiritual place, heaven. Is this consistent with the biblical perspective that seems to place such little emphasis on life beyond this world? Now, there are a number of profound and crucially important dimensions that this question just demands that we address. So let's dive right in and start considering them one by one. What obviously is underlying this first question is the realization that there is something of a tension between, on the one hand, talking about the afterlife, a realm outside of the world, and what we read in the Bible. Because the Bible really does strike us as exactingly focused upon what happens in this world. So much so that, as undoubtedly many of you are aware, in particular in the last couple of centuries, as people have attempted to dissect the Bible by disconnecting it from its divine source, from God, there has been the claim made that the Bible originally had no idea of everlasting life. And this is something that emerged because of alien influences later on. So the first thing that I feel compelled to emphasize today is that conclusion can only be reached by someone who doesn't read the Bible, or at the very least, who doesn't read the Bible seriously. Let's consider what the Bible itself tells us on the subject. Granted, this isn't a center stage, up in lights emphasis, and yet we turn first to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 is not an especially long way in to the Bible. And in Genesis chapter 5, we read in verses 21, 22, 23, and 24 about a man called Hanoch. I think generally transliterated into English as Enoch. And the Torah tells us something extraordinary about Hanoch. In verse 22, Hanoch walked with God. And in verse 24, not only repeating that Hanoch walked with God, but also the conclusion, the consequence of his walking with God, and he was not, because God took him. Now, In the Bible, that's the last we read about Hanoch. And I want to stress here, I'm not coming to delve deeply into what the Bible might mean, might not mean. I'm just looking at what the words are saying. Hanoch walked with God, and as it were, walked with God, clear out of this world. He was no longer here. Well, where was he? The Bible doesn't say. But the implication clearly is not that Hanoch was rewarded for walking with God by ceasing to exist. Rather, the emphasis here is God took him, and that's why he was no more in this world. God took him to some other realm. Call it whatever you choose. Call it heaven. Call it with God. Whatever you mean by it, it's not an end of existence. If anything, it's a level of existence that goes far beyond this world. In the case of Hanoch, well, given the lifespans of the generations that are described in Genesis chapter 5, his relatively brief lifespan of 365 years is extraordinarily short. After all, his son, Methuselah, lived to the age of 969. But clearly, Hanoch wasn't being punished with premature death. On the contrary, he walked with God, and God took him. So, of course, Hanoch inevitably is my first example from the Bible, but by no means the only one. Let's consider another extraordinary individual about whom we read considerably later on, the prophet Elijah, Eliyahu in Hebrew. And in what circumstance does Elijah leave this world? Well, of course, this is what we read in the second book of Kings in chapter 2, where the Bible dramatically describes to us how the prophet Elijah was taken in a whirlwind up to heaven. And as he and Elisha, his attendant, his apprentice prophet, are going, walking, and speaking, in verse 11, a chariot of fire and horses of fire divide between the two of them, and Elijah, Eliyahu, ascends in the whirlwind to heaven. Well, again, certainly Elijah is no longer here. Remember, afterward, the other bands of prophets entreat Elisha, go and look for him. And of course, they don't find him. He's not here. But he certainly isn't gone. And to drive that point home even more strongly, I'll share with you two additional verses about the prophet Elijah. The first of them in Chronicles 2, in chapter 21, verse 12. Here, we read of the sorry state of affairs after the king Yehoram succeeds his righteous father, King Yehoshaphat, to the throne of Judah. And Yehoram certainly does not follow in the footsteps of his father, even if he followed him in kingship. And we read in verse 12, a letter came from Elijah the prophet. It was a letter of rebuke to Yehoram and his cohorts. Now, besides the fact that the prophet Elijah didn't generally communicate by sending off letters, by our tradition, this letter was sent after the event that was described in Kings 2, chapter 2. Elijah had already ascended in the whirlwind to heaven. So he wasn't here. Well, he wasn't exactly here. But he certainly wasn't gone. He certainly didn't cease to exist. And of course, even more dramatically, at the very end of the prophets, the final verses of the final prophet, at the end of Malachi. In my Bible, I should note that this is Malachi chapter 3, verse 23, although I am aware that in some of your Bibles it may be in chapter 4. Obviously, this pertains to the relatively late internal division of the verses into discrete chapters. And here, this is the next to last verse of Malachi, the next to last verse of prophets. We read God's promise. Behold, I am sending you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the day of God, great and awesome. So clearly Elijah is not gone. He's gone to mere mortal eyes in this world. He's not here now. But life doesn't end when life here and now ends. That clearly is the guiding premise of what the Bible teaches us. And I'll note the extent to which this is really explicitly articulated. If we turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 21, presents to us an illuminating contrast between beasts and people. Now, yeah, beasts are also alive, no question about that. But beasts are physically alive. In the terms used in Ecclesiastes, they have a spirit, what is described in the Hebrew as ruach habehema, the spirit of the beast. But that doesn't mean a spiritual spirit. It means a life force. And so, we read in the verse, who knows that the spirit of people ascends upward. And the spirit, again, more properly rendered, life force of the beast, descends downward to the earth. Because that which is physical is subject to the limits of being physical. And so, when the animal dies, it just dies. It descends into the earth. Not so human beings. People The spirit of people, we read here, ascends upward. Now, I'm sure it is completely self-evident to you. I don't need to stress this point, but I'll still make it anyway. That when we speak of up and down here, we're certainly not speaking about altitude. I think I've mentioned previously one of the first Russian cosmonauts, upon reaching outer space, haughtily reported, "I've been to heaven and I didn't see God." What extraordinary obtuseness and stupidity. Just goes to show, sometimes those individuals who seem to be most intellectually gifted can be the most foolish and ignorant of all. First of all, you don't take a spaceship in order to reach heaven in this sense of the term. You don't reach God by going upward in altitude, but rather upward in spiritual level. In that sense, indeed, the spirit of people goes upward, because the spirit of people is a gift from God. And indeed, in much the same vein, skipping to the final chapter of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 12, verse 7, the dust returns upon the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Well, in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, we see very clearly the author is describing death. When a human being dies, obviously, whatever is there returns to where it came from. The body, well, we know, the body comes from dust. Doesn't make a difference on this plane what that dust precisely means. What it means for our purposes, for the purposes of the author of Ecclesiastes, is it is physical. The body is physical. And so, again, it returns to the dust as it was. Because after all, it is from that physical substrate that God created man in the first place. And the spirit returns to God who gave it. The spirit is not dust. And it doesn't return to dust. It returns to God. So again, so much for speaking of upward in terms of altitude. Can't help but note here, as at least a parenthetical aside, that if anything, you'd expect someone, at least someone with a sensitive human soul, to appreciate all the more so upon reaching the heavens in a celestial sense and being able to gaze out at the stars. To have the sensitivity that is so poignantly expressed in Isaiah in chapter 40, verse 26. Lift up heavenward your eyes and see who created these. See them. You should see God's hand. Sharpen space. You should indeed be endowed with one of the best front row opportunities, not to see God, but to see God's handiwork. But of course, we'll leave that as an aside and close the parentheses. What's important for us to appreciate is, obviously, again, in Ecclesiastes, the immortality of the soul was a foregone conclusion. And indeed, we should note further that it becomes clear in the Bible, immortality of the soul wasn't even only a foregone conclusion for those people who served God and believed in His Word. Consider, for example, the case of Bilam. Bilam, the soothsayer out of Midian, who was hired to curse Israel, and, as undoubtedly you recall, does not succeed in the mission, and instead ends up blessing Israel by force. The point that I'd like to focus upon is one of the things that he says, this in Numbers chapter 23, verse 10, in extolling the destiny of Israel. He says, "May my soul die the death of the upright, and may my end be like him." Now note the sequence here. May my soul die the death of the upright. If life ended in physical death, there wouldn't be any additional stage of may my end be like him. Altogether, if a person is dead, and that's all there is to life, then what difference does it make? But clearly it does make a difference. Clearly, so far as Bilam was concerned, life didn't end simply with physical death. To note an additional dimension that is fairly self-evident in this regard, just consider that one of the activities that God explicitly forbids in Deuteronomy chapter 18, where we find a whole long list of forbidden forms of divination and sorcery. And one of the actions that is forbidden, this in chapter 18 of Deuteronomy, verse 11, is inquiring of the dead. Now, what does that mean to inquire of the dead? Something that the Torah forbids. But clearly, people believed that even though someone is dead, they can still make inquiries. Just consider the famous, if jarring, passage at the end of the first book of Samuel, Samuel 1, chapter 28, when King Saul goes to a necromancer in order to raise the prophet Samuel from the dead. Now again, we stress, this is a severe violation of God's law. Unquestionably, it is a serious sin. But we're not focusing upon whether he should or should not have done it. He shouldn't have. We're focusing upon the realization that it was axiomatic in people's worldviews that the dead aren't gone, and therefore that it's possible to inquire of the dead if you so choose. So clearly, again, the idea of everlasting life is something that is self-evident and unquestionably recognized in the Bible. We should note in this regard that it's only by positing that there is everlasting life that we can understand the meaning of one of the most severe punishments meted out by God in the Bible, as we read really throughout the Torah. The first instance is when God commands Abraham concerning circumcision. It's a motif that appears repeatedly with respect to various perversions that the Torah forbids in Leviticus. punishment that in Hebrew is called karet, which literally means being cut off. In the formulation that we encounter repeatedly in the Torah, it is being cut off from your people. And of course, inevitably, again, we need to ask, what does that mean? What does it mean to be cut off from your people? Clearly, doesn't mean you all of a sudden perish or you have to move to a different part of the country. Rather, on the contrary, there are punishments that are meted out by the court. This isn't the punishment meted out by the court. This is a punishment by God. Being cut off from the people means there is an ongoing eternal existence of the people. And the person who is punished with karet, with being cut off, won't be part of that. Conversely, of course, among the righteous, being connected to one's people, being ingathered toward one's people, is precisely what happens by consequence of dying. This is likewise a recurrent motif in the Torah. We encounter it in the life and times of each of the patriarchs and more. That is, to consider the first instance, the death of Abraham, as portrayed in Genesis chapter 25, verse 8. Abraham expired and died in a good old age, elderly and satisfied, and he was ingathered to his people. What in the world is that supposed to mean? Ingathered to his people? His ancestors weren't where he died. Remember, his father Terach perished in Haran. The family is far away indeed. He's not being ingathered to his people in the sense of being buried with them. Yeah, but once a person dies, that person is indeed ingathered to his people, except for those criminals, those sinners who are punished with karet, with being cut off from their people. Indeed, in the case of Abraham, this is especially striking when one considers God's promise to Abraham as expressed in Genesis chapter 15, verse 15, when God tells Abraham that his seed will be strangers in a land not theirs, and proceeds to assure him, you will come to your fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. Well, what does being gathered to his fathers mean? If his father is buried way out in Haran, his earlier ancestors are certainly nowhere to be found. So, what does God mean? But of course, at this point, the answer should be clear. Because there is that realm of everlasting life. There is that realm of eternity that is described as being ingathered to one's people. I should merely note briefly that we find the self-same motif again in Genesis chapter 25 in verse 17 with respect to Yishmael. We find it in Genesis chapter 35 verse 28, verse 29 with respect to Isaac, and again with respect to Jacob in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob's expiring and being ingathered to his people is described in verse 33, and perhaps even more tellingly, lest anyone contend that being buried means being ingathered to your people. Consider in Genesis chapter 49, in verse 29, Jacob commands his children, I am being ingathered to my people. But now, bury me to my forefathers in the cave of Machpelah. Now, clearly, the burial and being ingathered to one's people are two separate things. Everyone eventually goes home. And that home is indeed everlasting life. We find similar expression with respect to Moses and Aaron. I don't want to belabor the point. I think it's adequate for us to appreciate that clearly everlasting life is axiomatic in the Bible. That is, it doesn't demand of us to read between the lines in order to see it. All you need to do is read the lines. They're there. So, clearly then, the Bible does indeed presume the promise of everlasting life. And yet at the same time, in a way, that makes the question all the greater. Because returning to the formulation of the question over here, is this consistent with the biblical perspective that seems to place such little emphasis on life beyond this world? It's true. The Bible does indeed place very little emphasis on life beyond this world. That is, this is a subtle point to appreciate, and I think it's important to clarify it. What we've seen in all of these many sources that we just discussed is that, so far as the Bible is concerned, everlasting life is obvious, veritably a foregone conclusion. And yet, still and all, it's not a point of emphasis in the Bible. The Bible is always talking about this world. It doesn't talk about the hereafter. So maybe the question that we need first to address before we can consider whether the emphasis upon everlasting life is or is not consistent with the biblical perspective is, why does the Bible so de-emphasize life beyond this world? Precisely once we recognize that it is a foregone conclusion from the perspective of the Bible that there is everlasting life, why isn't it more emphasized? Well, I'd like to, for the purposes of our discussion here, respond to this question on a number of different planes. Now, there are a lot of different planes at which we can address this question, but I'd like to limit myself, given our time constraints, to only 4. So, answer number 1, plane number 1, kind of flows directly from what we just observed. Why does the Bible place such little emphasis on life beyond this world? Simply because what's the point of emphasizing what is a self-evident truth? We just saw, not only among Bible believers who were servants of God, but even among sinners, even among pagans like Balaam. Belief in everlasting life was a veritable presumption. And indeed, when one considers some of what, from our perspective, we would consider to be the most primitive worldviews that existed in the ancient world, and not only in the ancient world, among pagans. The presumption that life goes on is almost universal. Just as a case in point, everyone's familiar, at least somewhat familiar, with Greek mythology. There's Hades, the underworld, where all the dead go. So clearly, even from the perspective of the pagan mythology of the ancient Greeks, there was everlasting life. On a far, far more sophisticated and elevated and exalted plane, consider the approach taken by the ancient Greek philosophers. For them, too, the possibility of everlasting life was obvious. Admittedly, they couched it in somewhat different terms. And I think it may be especially instructive for us here to consider why indeed, not just from the perspective of the pagans, but from the perspective of the philosophers, everlasting life was so obvious. In order to answer this question, we need to ask an additional question, which is, so why do people die? Why is there death? I'm not asking this question, mind you, from a spiritual or a theological perspective. I'm asking it from the perspective of physics. Why do things die? Why do all machines break down? Why does everything fall apart, including our own bodies? To give a precise physical answer to that question, I have to say, certainly for the benefit of those of you who are familiar with basic physics, the answer is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, expressed in fairly down-to-earth terms, tells us that disorder tends to increase. So if you have anything that is well-ordered, well-structured over the course of time, it falls apart. Your car starts out new, driving fine, and as time goes on, it gets run down. Your home progressively starts to break down. Your clothes wear out and become frayed. Your body decays and disintegrates. This is a law of physics that applies everywhere, everywhere in the physical world. So to the extent that we are dealing with something that is physical, it's subjected to that law of physics, second law of thermodynamics. Disorder tends to increase. With respect to animals, we already noted. Animals are animated by a life force, but they're still just physical beings. And so, animals are subject to the second law of thermodynamics too. Their bodies fall apart, decay, disintegrate. Everything ultimately is reduced to its elements, and as we saw it expressed in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that spirit, that life force of the animal descends into the earth. Well, with respect to human beings, to the extent that a human being is merely a physical being, that human being would also be subject to physical laws of decay. But human beings aren't just physical. Even from the perspective of the ancient Greek philosophers, who did not believe in a personal God, still and all, human beings are endowed with an intellect. The intellect is something that goes beyond the physical. The intellect is that transcendent spirit of man. You actualize that, you become something more than merely a physical being. So fine, with respect to this is physical. This ages and decays and disintegrates. But to the extent that we actualize ourselves spiritually, why on earth would you think that that spirit would simply disappear? Do ideas age and disappear? Of course you say, how can an idea age and disappear? It's not something physical. That's exactly the point. If you're not something physical, to the extent that you are not something physical, you transcend the limits of physicality. So, remember, we're still on the first level of answering the question, why the Bible speaks so little about everlasting life. Doesn't emphasize it. Clearly, it doesn't place the emphasis there. Why not? Well, again, it does not, because the Bible doesn't trouble itself or us to belabor the obvious. An everlasting life of the Spirit is obvious. A spiritual reward for being a spiritual being is obvious. The Bible instead emphasizes this world. It emphasizes even reward and punishment in this world. Just consider Leviticus chapter 26, the blessing and the curse in this world. Deuteronomy chapter 11, the blessing and the curse here, now, in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 28, even greater elaboration. Again, the blessing and the curse. All in the material world. That's the novelty. That's what you might not have expected. That there is a realm of the Spirit. That was obvious. That the realm of the Spirit impacts on what takes place in this world, here and now. That's something surprising. That, then, is what the Bible, the Torah in particular, is driven to stress, to recognize that the Spirit impacts on the material as well. And it's important for us to appreciate why indeed that is the case. Not, mind you, because that makes this world here and now the most important thing. Rather, because ultimately we recognize this world here and now is where we are. So, for example, if we speak of the long, drawn-out process of becoming a righteous human being. Inevitably, that will take you clear beyond this world. But it's got to start someplace. By emphasizing this world, what God drives home to us is the realization that this world is where we operate. This world is not an end in itself, but the only way you get to that end that goes beyond this world is by acting in this world. And so, then, to that extent, our first plane of understanding why the Bible so de-emphasizes life beyond this world, not because that everlasting spiritual existence is inconsequential, but it's just not the point that the Torah needs to emphasize to us. Spiritual life will take care of itself. We need to focus on what we're doing here. And inevitably, that brings me to plane number 2 in our discussion. Plane number 2, which pretty much follows directly from what we've just said, is so long as we are alive in this world, the spirituality that counts for us is spirituality in this world. The moment we get ourselves distracted from spirituality in this world, we start focusing on what for us is counterfeit spirituality. I realize, speaking of counterfeit spirituality sounds like a very, very strong expression. So let me give you an illustration of what I mean. And I'm apologizing in advance for using as my illustration something that I'm sure we all find utterly revolting. Everyone, I'm sure, remembers very well September 11th, 2001. The hijackers flying their planes full of human cargo into their targets to destroy all of these lives, all of these innocent lives, to make what, for them, was a religious statement. Ostensibly. From their perspective, an act of self-sacrifice to reach a realm of spirituality beyond this world. Do you remember what the hijackers were doing the night before they committed mass murder on an almost unprecedented level? I can't bring myself to actually verbalize with what they were preoccupied that night before. I'm sure many of you remember. If you like, it's well documented. They weren't engaged in spiritual pursuits, not by a long shot. And while undoubtedly they would have claimed they're focused on a spirituality that goes beyond this world, spirituality that's out of this world is out of bounds. In practice, there is little or no difference between someone who is totally a non-believer and denies spirituality altogether, and someone who professes being a believer and believing in a spirituality that is exclusively otherworldly. Because, you know, these two people have the most important thing in common, and that is that spirituality in this world is non-existent to them. Both lives are bankrupt. And it's, again, level 2. The realization, then, that God does not focus our attention on any kind of otherworldly spirituality, because God is intent on directing our attention to what we need to do in this world to make this world a more godly place, to infuse this physical world with spirituality. Because again, remember, the physical world is not an end in itself. It is a means to the spirit. But you're only going to get to that end of the spirit if you take the means seriously. Now, the third level, remember, there are 4. It's somewhat more abstract, but I think it relates very directly to what we just said about level number 2. Level number 2, I remind you, was the realization that as human beings in this world, the spirituality that matters to us is spirituality in this world. Level number 3 is the realization that we altogether are obviously rooted, anchored in this world. The Bible, after all, is God's word revealed through the prophets. Well, even the prophets are rooted in this world. The spirituality they understand is the spirituality of this world. The prophets themselves, then, are not a medium for telling us about a realm that is not only totally beyond us, but even totally beyond them. And because, again, we need to focus our attention on what we're doing here and now. And that, finally, at last, brings me to the 4th level, the last plane at which I'd like to consider why the Bible so de-emphasizes everlasting life. It pretty much is the level that already emerges from everything we've already said, but I'm going to stress it as an additional and final level here, and that is from the perspective of the Bible. And of course that means from the perspective of God, who gives us the Bible. Anything that distracts us from what we're supposed to be doing is distracting us from the most important thing of all. What we're supposed to be doing is not sitting back and contemplating the realm of everlasting life beyond this world. What we're supposed to be doing is not to start meditating over a realm of the spirit that is above and beyond and transcendent. What we're supposed to be doing is responding to God's summons as He gives it to us throughout the Bible. To act, to do, to make this world, this physical world, a more godly place. We do it by focusing upon this world. We do it by focusing upon spirituality in this world. We do not do it by distracting ourselves from this world and becoming preoccupied with a realm that is out there. God has endowed us with a soul, with a nature, with an outlook that is exquisitely suited to what provides us with the ultimate key to a life well spent, to the satisfaction, to the exhilaration, to the uplifting realization that I have lived for something of consequence. The way God endowed us with the wherewithal to do that is by providing us with a soul, with a mind that focuses our attention on what we're doing here. On making this world better. On making this world more godly. On becoming, as God charges us, as we discussed, of course, on many occasions, God's junior partners, so to speak, in creation. God set up the world and charges us to do our utmost to keep it going. So, of course, then, when we consider the gamut of these answers to the question, so why does the Bible place so little emphasis on life beyond this world? We appreciate a crucially important key here. The lack of emphasis is not because everlasting life is unimportant or inconsequential. Of course, simple arithmetic is sufficient to appreciate that everlasting life is far more consequential in the long run than our lives in this world. What I mean by simple arithmetic is, how much time do we have altogether in this world? As expressed in Psalms chapter 90, verse 10, what altogether is the length of our lives in this world? Our years in them, 70 years, and in case of might, 80 years, even 120 years, compared with eternity, it's nothing. As expressed in Psalm 144, verse 4, our days here are like a fleeting shadow. So, of course, to that extent, we recognize inevitably that life beyond this world is incalculably greater, and thus incalculably of greater consequence in the long run than our lives in this world. But simultaneously, we recognize we only get there by ensuring that as long as we are in this world is what counts for us. This world is what is important for us, not the beyond. We have an ancient saying in our tradition that this world is like a corridor leading to the banquet hall. So, of course, on the one hand, you derive from the analogy that this world is only a corridor when you compare it with the banquet hall of the hereafter. But I think there's an additional dimension that is even more important to appreciate in this statement. So long as you're in a corridor, you better remember you're in the corridor and act like you're in a corridor. How do you act like you're in a corridor? You keep moving forward. You don't sit down. You sit down when you get to the banquet hall. Well, the banquet hall will take care of itself. Just make sure you remember, in this world, all that matters is always going forward with God, going forward on behalf of God, going forward in making ourselves and the world more godly. So, returning to question 1 by way of conclusion. Some religions teach that this life is lesser than the afterlife, or that it is a test to get to a better, more spiritual place, heaven. Well, true, in a way, Is this consistent with a biblical perspective that seems to place such little emphasis on life beyond this world? And of course, inevitably, the answer is yes and no. It depends what you mean. Because, once again, if we speak in terms of absolute value, again, we recognize nothing in the puny, finite bounds of this world can possibly compare with eternity. And yet, simultaneously we recognize our focus is here. Our focus is now. Our focus is on recognizing it is what we do to make this world a more spiritual, more godly place that is of critical importance to us more than anything else. And as a result, indeed, God's promises are in this physical world. Perhaps one of the greatest promises of all, as we read it in Exodus chapter 23, verse 26. The days of your lives I will fulfill. The number of your days, the length of your life. If life were not the great gift that it is, and I mean life in this world, you might think that God's promise is a threat. Live long in this terrible world? We don't regard this world as terrible. We rather regard this world as the greatest gift because it is the greatest opportunity. Again, eternity is, of course, forever. But here and now, we have this world and all of the work we need to do in it. And that needs to be our emphasis. And it is on this note, then, that we continue with the related second question. In Jewish sources, the domain of everlasting life is often called Olam haba, which is usually translated as the world to come or eternal life. What is the biblical basis for this? And what does it mean for us here in this world today? So, of course, in considering the expression in Hebrew, Olam haba, and in particular, in attempting to respond to the question, what is the biblical basis for this? The first thing I need to stress is, biblical basis for the expression Olam haba? There is none. The term doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. The expression Olam haba is exclusively one that we find in post-biblical works, beginning with the written compendiums of the oral tradition that were recorded after the closure of the Hebrew Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash. So, first answer, what is the biblical basis for it? No biblical basis, at least not overtly. And yet, there are inevitably here, too, a number of dimensions that should be borne in mind. First, on a linguistic note, we should observe that the Hebrew Olam haba carries within it a certain element of ambiguity, by which I mean we could translate this expression correctly in more than one way. The conventional translation, as noted in the question, is the world to come. But it's significant to note that in Aramaic. And as undoubtedly you know, Aramaic was the spoken language of the Jews after their return from the Babylonian exile. Aramaic is, after all, the second language of the Bible. Most of the book of Daniel, parts of Ezra, even a couple of words in Genesis, are in Aramaic. In Aramaic, the proper expression for Olam haba is alema de'ate. To translate that rigorously, that's not the world to come. That is the world that is coming. Which is, I will stress, a legitimate translation of the Hebrew, Olam haba, as well. Now, what's the difference between saying the world to come and the world that is coming? Doesn't it sound like just simple semantics? Well, we're communicating. And when we communicate, inevitably, semantics are important. But here it's important for us to appreciate the distinction between these two translations is of profound significance to each and every one of us and what we're doing here in this world today. Because when you translate the expression Olam haba as the world to come, it carries the connotation of trashing this world and replacing it. Whereas when you render Olam haba as the world that is coming, it's coming. Because apropos of everything we discussed in the first question, we're doing our work in this world as God commands us to make this world a better, more godly, more spiritual place. We are then progressively, gradually redeeming this world, making this world more and more into that world that is coming. That world in which everything that is deficient, everything that is lacking, everything that is incomplete in this world will attain its ultimate fulfillment. Now, it's of course important for me to emphasize here. Does that mean that we are in business for ourselves in making this world into that world that is coming? Of course, the answer is no. We don't have the wherewithal to carry this world into that realm by ourselves. But I repeat the expression I used earlier, being God's junior partners. God still gave us charge. God still gave us a mission. God still tells us what we're supposed to be doing. And to the extent that we listen, we indeed are engaging in that process of transforming this world into that world that is coming. Now, once we appreciate, on the one hand, that bridge between this world and the world that is coming, but on the other hand, the gap between them, we return to the question of biblical basis. That is, we have an ancient saying in this regard that even the prophets didn't prophesy with respect to Olam haba, with respect to the world that is coming. Even prophets are capable only of envisioning the Messianic era because Olam haba a realm in which everything deficient, everything flawed, everything missing in this world is fulfilled and completed. That is a completely different frame of reference that even the prophets cannot envision. And yet, simultaneously, if we ask, if it's not explicitly described in the Bible, what is the basis of our conviction that this world is coming? And moreover, if we ask ourselves, how does it all together relate to the message of the Bible? Then, to answer these questions, I'd like us to consider an additional nuance in the text of the Bible. To share two examples from Deuteronomy to illustrate the point. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, in my Bible, it's verse 15. In your editions, it may be a verse off. Honor your father and your mother, as God your Lord commanded you, so that your days will be prolonged, you will live long, and so that it will be good for you. Now, this isn't just a commandment. This is a commandment with a payback. You will live long, and it will be good for you. In almost the self-same terms, we read in Deuteronomy chapter 22, in verses 6 and 7, the precept, the commandment, that if you chance upon a nest and you want to take the eggs or the young, you must chase away the mother bird first. That way the mother bird won't experience the anguish of seeing her eggs or chicks taken before her own eyes. And here too, in verse 7, we read, you shall surely send away the mother, and then, only then, take the children, so that it will be good for you, and you will live long. Almost the self-same reward. Longevity and goodness. And that brings me to a story. A story recorded in our tradition, and seems, from the way it's presented, that's a true tale. A father asks his son to fetch the eggs in yonder nest up in the tree, and the son dutifully obeys his father and climbs up the tree, and seeing the mother bird on the nest, in dutiful obedience of Deuteronomy chapter 22, sends away the mother bird. Note, he fulfilled two commandments of God: honoring his father, sending away the mother bird, both of which carry this extraordinary reward: living long, and it will be good for you. And on his way down the tree, he fell and broke his neck and died. And the rabbis record that there was actually a witness there, just seeing that tragic death was enough to drive him away from God. He turned his back on God, on God's word, and never returned. After all, God promised, He'll live long and it'll be good for him. So where's his living long and where's it good for him? But we have a different answer to that question. The rabbis responded, you live long in a realm that is altogether long, eternal life, and it will be good for you in a world that is all goodness. That's not this one. In this world, it's never all goodness. And in this world, we all die. So on the one hand, consider this. The way God expresses himself in the promise in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Deuteronomy chapter 22 is, you will live long and it'll be good for you. Certainly sounds like it's talking about this world. Because on the one hand, on this hand, it is. Because everything God tells us about, everything that God enjoins us to do or warns us against doing, all of it is in this world. All of it is how to live in this world. All of it is what we need to do here and now in this world. But all of it simultaneously is hinting at another realm. Is hinting at the beyond. Hinting at that realm of the Spirit, the everlasting life that is not here and not now. So, when we ask what is the biblical basis for Olam haba, on the one hand, of course, we already gave the answer. There is none. On the other hand, on a deeper level, the biblical basis is, first and foremost, we know God loves us. He doesn't create us merely to snuff us out. And furthermore, we see all around us a physical universe, and we know that a physical universe is never an end in itself. It never could have been an end in itself. It was never designated to be an end in itself. It is all means to that ultimate end that goes beyond the physical, that touches the spirit. That's the basis for our believing in the world that is coming. That's the basis of our conviction that whatever we're doing in this world should be dedicated to building that godly world toward which this world is headed. We're not there yet. That world ultimately is only seen by God. By us here, now, it's beyond us. But it's a beyond that still guides us in what we do here. Because of the conviction that whatever is incomplete in this world will become complete in Olam haba, in the world that is coming, that redoubles our commitment to do our utmost to fix up everything that needs to be fixed up in this world. We don't do it in business for ourselves. We do it because God commands us and God shows us the way. We also don't do it because we have the temerity to think that we can do it on our own and finish it all off. But we do it with the conviction that God, in showing us the way, is giving us the means to bring this world progressively closer to that conclusion. So, the final component of the question, what does it mean for us here in this world today? What it means for us here in this world today is we have God-given work to do. We have God's charge to answer. We have His mission to accomplish in advancing the world toward that ultimate goal. We live here and now in this world with a sideward glance toward eternity, because everything we're doing here tends toward that goal. May we respond to the charge and build, as God bids us, that world of the future. God bless you.